Hey everybody, it's Scott Shetler and welcome to this week's episode of Strength and Health TV. This week I want to talk about something called accommodating resistance. Basically, accommodating resistance, in a nutshell, is using bands and chains attached to the barbell to perform some of the classical lifts that we use in powerlifting and strength training. It's the reason any of us know about accommodating resistance is through the work of Louis Simmons from the Westside Barbell Club. And if you want to learn more about this, I definitely recommend reading his articles, reading his books. He's written extensively about this stuff. So basically all I'm presenting today is what I've learned through his writings, as well as traveling up to Westside to get to work with him directly. And the biggest thing that I see with accommodating resistance particularly is people who post videos on the internet or talk about it, they really don't know how to set up the bands and chains properly, or why even use accommodating resistance or how it applies to training. So I want to talk a little bit about the concepts behind it, as well as show you how to properly set up the bands and the chains for squatting and bench pressing. Basically, there's three main reasons to use accommodating resistance. Accommodating resistance is basically a form of contrast training, again, where you're attaching chains and or bands to the barbell before you do the lift. Now there's other ways to implement it, but for the most part, we generally use it when we talk about performing dynamic effort work, which is speed strength work, where we're working typically between 75 and 85% of a 1 rep max in a lift for a given amount of volume. Typically in the squat, we're going to work 10 to 12 sets of 2, so we're looking at 20 to 24 lifts at the target weight. And in the bench press, we're doing about 8 to 9 sets of 3, so we're getting about 24 to 27 lifts per workout at the target weight. Now for percentages, we want to look at, for the squat, we're typically going to work what Louis refers to as a 3-week pendulum wave, where you're going to start out in week 1 using 50% of a 1 rep max with about 25% of accommodating resistance. That's how you get to 75% at the low end. Week 2, you're going to move up to 55% of a 1 rep max. Week 3, you're going to move up to 60% of a 1 rep max, again using 25% accommodating resistance. So that's how you get to 75, 80, and 85% over the 3-week wave. And then in week 4, you're going to cycle back down to week 1. That's in the squat. In the bench press, you're going to go a little bit lighter. You're going to work about 40 to 50% of a 1 rep max or a 1 rep max of a floor press. And you're going to stay at that percentage range and just do a straight wave with the bands or the chains attached to the bar. So there's 3 reasons that you use bands and chains or accommodating resistance as it is. One is to accommodate the resistance. What do we mean by accommodate the resistance? Basically, if you look at any lift, there's what's called the strength curve. And at various points of the lift, due to the leverages used during the lift is going to feel harder or easier depending on where you're at. The more favorable the leverage, the easier the lift is going to feel. The less favorable, the weaker you're going to feel. So for instance, if we're talking about the squat, you're going to be able to quarter squat a lot more than you could full squat all the way down where you're breaking parallel. So when we look at that strength curve, the lift is a lot harder in the bottom and it gets easier as we go up and the hips get more under the bar. So as you squat, the hips are displaced behind the bar as you lower down into the movement, and then as the hips get closer to the bar as you go into full joint extension, the lift gets easier from perceived effort level. Obviously the bar weight is not changing when you're using straight weight. So if you're squatting 400, the bar weighs 400 at the top and the bottom of the lift. It's the leverage that makes it difficult or easy. For instance, you quarter squat that weight, it's going to be a lot easier than doing a full squat because of the hip displacement and the joint angles. In the bench press, when you got the bar down on the chest, it's a lot harder than just bringing the bar down a couple inches and then pressing. So a partial bench press would be a lot easier than getting those elbows bent down to 90 degrees or whatever it takes to touch the chest. So when we look at those lifts and we apply this form of contrast to the bar in bands or chains, when we're at full extension in the bench or we're at full extension in the squat, we've got most of the weight of the chains and the greatest amount of tension from the bands on the bar. So there is more weight at the top of the lift. Then as we descend in the squat or we lower the bar to the chest in the bench press, if you're using bands, because of band shrinkage, the tension goes away And with the chains, you're using a loader chain, which I'll show in a minute, but you're using a loader chain to attach the heavy chains to the bar. As that bar travels down in the squat or the bench press, chain starts to pile up on the ground and deload off the bar. So if we've got 80 pounds of chain attached to the bar, at the top of the lift, you're going to feel all 80 pounds, but then as you go down into the bottom of the lift, chain's going to start deloading onto the ground, so the bar is going to get lighter, and when you're in the bottom of the squat or the bottom of the bench, you're going to have just the barbell weight, and then as you press or you come up out of the squat, the chain reloads, so you get that contrast with the amount of chain that you're using in the lift. Now with the bands, like I said, due to the band shrinkage, the tension goes away. So at the top of the lift, you got more tension from the band. At the bottom of the lift, you got less tension from the band. There is some factor that is overlooked when you're using the bands. You're getting added kinetic energy by the accelerated eccentric phase of the lift. And what I mean by that is because band is rubber resistance and is active, if you set the bands up properly, which I'll show in a minute, you should have tension in the bottom of the lift as well as top of the lift. Obviously the tension goes away because the band is shrinking, but it's an active kind of tension. So the band's actually pulling the barbell down faster than if you're just lowering the bar without the bands to it. So that's creating more kinetic energy in the muscles. And when you reverse the movement, that allows for more force production. So if you think about, if you take a basketball, and if I just drop a basketball, it's going to bounce a couple of inches. But if I slam that ball into the ground, it's going to bounce a lot higher. So faster down, faster up, and that's what the bands do. They pull you down faster so you can display more power on the lift. And does it work? Absolutely, it works. Not just with my power lifters who I've seen get stronger using these methods, but for athletes. I used to work with a lot of football players. I remember having a outside linebacker from Georgia Southern come train with me for his pro day when I was doing a lot more work with these guys, these college football players on pro day preparation and getting ready for combines and such. One of the events that they had to do in these pro days or the combines is a vertical jump and sometimes a broad jump. Now the vertical jump, they're just standing still, they're throwing themselves down and then jumping up using a reactive movement. So they've got the downward movement followed by a quick amortization phase, which is the transfer from the downward phase to the upward phase of the jump, and then obviously the jump. So what we found is that the more explosive the athlete, the faster they go down, the more explosive they're going to be in the jump. So this linebacker, he jumped 29 inches when I tested him when he started working with me. 6 weeks later, at his pro day, he jumped 39.5 inches. Now this was a combination of strengthening up some weak muscles that were preventing him from displaying the greatest amount of power in his jump, but also all of the work that we did on his dynamic effort work, the squatting, the benching, the pulls, were done with bands and chains and this accommodating resistance. So he developed a tremendous amount of power in a very short period of time. And we've seen this work with my power lifters. Their squats get stronger, their deadlifts get stronger as well. So the second reason you use bands is the added kinetic energy by accelerating the downward or the descending, the eccentric phase of the lift. And in a nutshell, faster down, faster up. Now the last reason is when you use bands and chains, like I said, as you drop down to the weaker part of the lift, the tension goes away or the weight deloads, but then as you raise up out of the squat or you press the bar off your chest, as you go into that full extension where you get into a more mechanically favorable position and you get stronger and the weight is perceived as lighter, well, that's where the tension gets greater in the band, and that's where that weight reloads onto the bar from the chain. So this causes you to continue to accelerate throughout the entire lift. So it nearly eliminates the deceleration that happens at the top of the lift. So it teaches you to blast through your sticking points when you're using the appropriate percentages. And like I said, with 25% accommodating resistance added to the bar, you want to be between 50 and 60% in the squat and roughly 40 to 50% in the bench. And that gets you into the correct percentages. Then using the correct volume or the number of lifts, where we're working about 20 to 24 squats in a workout and we're working about 24 to 27 benches in the workout. Again, typically you're doing 10 to 12 sets of 2. It's usually 12 sets of 2 in week 1 with 50% of the squat, 12 sets of 2 in week 2 with 55% of the squat, 10 sets of 2 in week 3 with 60% of the squat. And then in the bench press, it's 8 to 9 sets of 3 with the 40 to 50% plus accommodating resistance. So those are the three main reasons that you use the bands or the chains in your training. Like I said, typically it's done with a dynamic effort day. We do use accommodating resistance on max effort lifts just to create some variety and get that overload at the top of the lift as well. But typically when we talk about this accommodating resistance, we're talking about speed strength work or dynamic effort work. It can also be used in explosive power work. You're just going to lower the percentages. You're going to be working between about 30 and 40% instead of between 50 and 60% of bar weight with the accommodating resistance. So you're going to be able to move even faster due to the decreased bar weight. Now, you always get the question, how much chain, how much band to use. This is definitely experimental, but here are some general guidelines that you can start using in your programming, and then you can customize from there. But remember, when we're talking about speed strength work, when we're talking about explosive power work, bar speed is the most important. Louis found through work that he did with physics professors and attaching Tendo units, a device that measures bar speed to the barbells, that the optimal speed of movement for this dynamic effort training is roughly 0.8 meters per second. This doesn't mean that you've got to go out and get a bar speed measuring device and put it on your bar. As long as you're training at the appropriate percentages with the appropriate amount of band tension or chain weight, you should be fine, because he did this on a bunch of highly qualified lifters out of his gym. They were all 800-pound squatters or greater, I believe, when he did these tests. So these guys knew what they were doing. They knew how to move the barbell, and what they found was that 50 to 60% was the optimal bar weight when you're using 25% accommodating resistance in the squat. So as a general rule of thumb, with the squat for chains, if you squat 400 or less, you're going to use one set of 5/8 chains. Now the 5/8 chain is 5 feet long, and you're basically going to fold it in half and attach it to a loading chain on the bar so you get a complete deload at the bottom. And that length of chain weighs 20 pounds. So with a pair of 5/8 chains, you're going to have about 40 pounds of chain on the bar in addition to the bar weight that you're using. If you squat 400 to 600, you're going to use 2 sets of 5/8 chain on each side. And then if you squat over 600, you're going to use 3 sets of 5/8 chain on each side. So 6 total chains if you're using 3 sets, 4 total chains if you're using 2 sets, 1 chain on each side if you're using just the 1 set of chain. Again, they're 5/8 chain lengths, and they're 5 feet long, and that gives you about 20 pounds per set of chain. Now again, you can adjust. You know, if you're using these, say, on max effort day, you might use more chain to get more of a contrast, more of an overload at the top, but for dynamic effort training, that is a good place to start. And again, bar speed is always the ruling factor when you're talking about this dynamic effort or speed strength training. Now for the bench, if you bench up to 300, you're going to use 1 set of chain. Now the chains are attached a little bit differently in the bench. You're still using that loading chain, but you're going to set the 5/8 chain up so that when you're at lockout, about half of the chain is deloaded onto the ground already, so that when you lower the bar, because the bar is traveling a shorter distance than in the squat, you get a complete deload at the bottom. So again, when you're at lockout, half of the chain is going to be on the ground, and then that will provide a complete deload when you get the barbell on your chest. So if you bench up to 300 pounds, you can use 1 set of 5/8 chain. If you bench between 300 and 500 pounds, so in that 400 pound range, you're going to be using 2 sets of chain. And then if you bench 500 or more, you're going to be using 3 sets of chain on your dynamic effort work. Now for the bands, for squatting, if you squat up to 400 pounds, you're going to use a light band. If you buy your bands from Westside Barbell, that's the purple band, that's an 1.5-inch band. And you need to, and I'll show this on the setup, but you need to make sure that you're choking it around a base that's wide enough that you have tension in the bottom of the lift. So about a 4x4 base is pretty good, although you could go wider if you want to get more tension in the band. I think when I was up at Westside on their monolift, they have the base of the monolift, plus I think a 4x4 or maybe even 2 4x4s that they choke their bands around, so you're getting a tremendous amount of tension out of the bands. If you squat between 400 and 600, you're going to use an average band, which is a 2-inch band. Again, if you're buying your bands from Westside Barbell, they're the green band. And then if you squat more than 600, you're going to use the strong band, which is the blue band if you're buying your bands from Westside Barbell, and that's the 2.5-inch band. Again, making sure that you're choking them around a wide enough base that you get tension at the bottom of the lift. Now, if you want to get more specific and find out exactly how much tension the bands are creating, all you got to do is set your bands up, set them on the barbell, get a scale, stand on the scale with the bar on your back like you're going to squat it, see what you weigh, and then subtract your body weight and the bar weight to find out how much band tension you're getting. It's pretty simple to do, and that's a good way if you want to get really specific with this. That's one way to do it. In the bench press, you're going to use a mini band, and you're going to double it and put both ends over the barbell. And I'm going to show you how to double it, but basically you can double it around a heavy dumbbell handle. You could, if you've got a rack that's got the sumo base, you can wrap it around the bar, and or the sumo base, and then choke it over the top of the bar, both ends over the top of the bar. But basically in the bench, you're going to use a double mini band. Some really strong benchers can get away with a monster mini band, which is a little bit thicker than the mini. It's going to give you a little bit more band tension, but that's generally what you're going to use for all your benching for the speed strength or the dynamic effort work. So we're going to take a minute now, and I'm going to go show you in the rack how to set up the bands and the chains properly and what is the improper way. So we're going to look at the squat first. I've already got a set of chain loaded onto the bar here. Again, you're going to use your loader chain, which is about a 1/4 inch chain, and that's going to be about 5.5, maybe 6 feet long, so that you've got enough length to work with based on the height of your squatters. Then you're going to have a heavy or some sort of clip that you can attach your heavy chains to. I just use a spring clip here, a really big one, that I can add multiple sets of 5/8 chain to. As we get stronger, we need more band tension. But again, or excuse me, chain tension. The way the chains work is at the top of the lift, in the squat, you're going to have a couple of the links touching the ground. And then when you get down to the bottom of the squat, the heavy chain is going to be completely deloaded. Then when you raise up, that heavy chain is going to reload. So you just simply drape your loader chain over the collar, sleeve of the bar, and then you hang the heavy 5/8 chain from that loader chain again, so that when you're at lockout in the squat, a few links are on the ground to prevent the chain from swinging around, to ensure that you got a full deload of the chain at the bottom of the lift. Now the incorrect way to do this, and this is how I see so many people set up their chains, they don't use the loading chain, which allows for the deload of the chain. They just take a heavy chain and they attach it to the bar like this, which completely defeats the purpose. You go down and only a portion of the chain loads onto the ground, so you're not getting a contrast because the chain's not deloading at the bottom of the lift. So when you squat and you bench, you've got to use that loading chain that allows the heavy chain to completely deload at the bottom of the lift. Now when you're doing floor presses and deadlifts, you don't need a loading chain. You can just drape the heavy chains over the barbell because you're so close to the ground that most of the chain's going to end up on the bar. But for squatting and benching, you've got to use that 1/4 inch chain as a loader chain so that you get a complete deload at the bottom of the lift. So that's how you set up the chains for squatting. If you want to look at setting up the bands for squatting, typically what you want to do is have a wide enough base down at the bottom of your power rack. I've got a rack from Elite Fitness that's got the sumo base, so it's elevated. It's a 2x2 rack, so that's not quite wide enough to choke the band around to have tension at the bottom. So what I've done is I've taken a dumbbell and I've set it next to my rack, and I wrap my band around the dumbbell and the sumo base so we get a wider base to choke the band around. And then you just take the band and pull it up over the bar, collar of the bar, like that. And again, you see there's plenty of tension there. And then most importantly, when I'm in the bottom of the lift, there's still tension on the band. So you can play with the width of the base, but somewhere at least 4x4 is good, but you can go even wider to get more tension out of your bands. So that's how you set up your bands for squatting. Now let's take a look at setting up bands and chains for benching. Now again, with the chains, you're going to use that loading chain, but you're going to have to shorten the loading chain because the bar is a lot closer to the ground. Remember, when you're at lockout, you want to make sure that about half the chain is on the ground when you're fully locked out, so that when you get that bar down to the chest, you've got a complete deload in the chain. So again, you have your 1/4 inch loading chain, and you just drape that over the collar of the bar. And that's going to put about half the chain when you're at lockout, half the heavy chain when you're at lockout on the ground, so that again, when you hit the chest, the chain completely deloads. You press the bar, it reloads. And again, you simply go down in the lift, chain deloads on the ground, you come up, and a portion of the chain reloads. You're getting about half the weight of the chain because half of it's already on the ground. Again, the incorrect way to load chains is just to hang a heavy chain from the bar. You get no contrast, no deload. Unless, of course, you're doing a floor press where you're draping the chain over the collar of the bar. Now for the bench press, you're going to take your mini band and you're going to go underneath your sumo base or the handle of a heavy dumbbell, heavy enough so that the band doesn't pull it up when it's at full tension. And then you're going to take, unlike the squat where you choke the band around the base and just take one end up over the bar, you're actually going to double the band around the base and put both ends over the bar, because in the bench press, the bar's a lot closer to the ground when you're laying on the bench, so there wouldn't be enough tension in the band if you just did a single choke. You'd have to have a massive base to do it. So it's just easier to double the band up and wrap the double bend underneath the base of the squat rack or the handle of the heavy dumbbell, and then put both ends over the bar. So again, you're just going to take that mini band, double it up underneath your squat rack or your bench rack, or again the handle of a heavy dumbbell, and then you take both ends of the band and put it over the bench, so you're doubling up your mini band and putting it over the collar of the bar. So that is the correct way to load bands and chains onto the barbell for squatting and benching, and hopefully you've gotten a little bit better idea why you use the bands. If you listen to a bunch of the crap that's out there on the internet, you know, a lot of people like to bash the Westside system and say, you know, bands and chains don't work, or bands and chains only work for equipped lifters because gear helps you out at the bottom of the lift. It doesn't help you out at the top of the lift, so that's why you want the bands and chains on the bar, because that's where it overloads the point of lift. It's complete nonsense. Bands accommodate resistance. When you're in the bottom of the lift, yeah, the gear might be giving you a little pop off the bottom, but as you stand up, you're still feeling more of the weight at the top, just like if you're lifting raw. So you want to oppose your strength curve. So whether you're lifting raw or whether you're lifting in gear, bands and chains can be beneficial for the strength athlete. For regular athletes who don't compete in gear, like my swimmers, my football players, my baseball players, my fighters, we use bands and chains to help with eliminating deceleration, so it teaches them to be more explosive, more powerful. Plus with the bands, like I said, you're getting that benefit of the kinetic energy because of the active resistance with the accelerated eccentric phase of the movements. So we're producing more power by using these as well. So bands and chains can be very beneficial for regular athletes outside of powerlifters or strength athletes. They work very well for raw powerlifters. All my lifters I train right now are raw lifters, and they follow a standard Westside template in here where they do their dynamic effort days, their max effort days. They all box squat all the time. They use bands and chains, and they only continue to hit PRs every time they go to a meet. So the system works if you take the time to study and learn the system from the man, from Louis himself. Buy his books, watch his videos, schedule a trip up there if you're a trainer, and go work with him directly. He's got an open door policy as long as you set up a time to visit and make sure he's there and that he can accommodate your schedule. But if you can go up and work with him hands-on, that's the best way to learn this stuff. He's a wealth of knowledge. He's got probably around 40 plus years in the industry studying this stuff. He's worked with physics professors. He's worked with numerous high-level athletes, not just powerlifters, and they've seen nothing but great success. So like I said, success always leaves clues. Learn how to use this stuff to your benefit. Don't be closed-minded, be open-minded, study, learn, and apply. Now, like I said, with the bands and the chains, you have to use the appropriate volumes. You've got to use the right weight. So all this information's out there. I gave you a little bit of that info today, but read Louis' books, read his articles, buy his DVDs, watch his DVDs, and you should get all the knowledge that you need as far as the loading, how to implement these into your training, and so on and so forth. But make sure you do it correctly. Don't do the stuff incorrectly. I remember seeing this ridiculous study that came out in one of the NSCA journals that basically said bands and chains were worthless, and then come to find out they weren't even attaching the stuff properly. They weren't using loading chains and chains to get the contrast. They weren't attaching the bands properly so that you had tension in the bottom of the lift. So I mean, when you do the stuff improperly, and if you don't use highly qualified athletes like Louis did when he was doing his studies, you're going to get piss poor results. So make sure you learn the stuff correct. Make sure you learn how to do the stuff correctly. Make sure you apply it correctly, and you'll see success just like I have in here. So hopefully you enjoyed this week's episode on accommodating resistance or bands and chains. And if you got any questions, make sure you leave them down below the comment section of this video. And until next week, stay strong, stay healthy.